Welcome to Programming User Interfaces. In this lecture, we're going to look at CSS by using CSS frameworks. So in the previous videos, we went through styling the New York Times site, project site, using our customized kind of vanilla CSS. So we didn't start off with any existing CSS rules except the browser default values, and we went through and modified the CSS rules, added new rules, etc. Right? So that's a great way of doing things, to learning how to, all the aspects of various CSS rules and how to implement them. So a lot of folks don't have used more kind of pre-existing solutions, or kind of pre-available libraries that allow you to do these sort of CSS things much more rapidly. So today we're going to be looking at using a CSS library and how you go about implementing that on the New York Times site. So this is not necessarily a better way of doing it, or a way that you should be doing it. It's just showing, if you wanted to use a library, an existing CSS library, then how you would go about installing it and getting it ready to work. So there are a lot of different CSS libraries available. To get started with, you'd have to find one that you want to use. Some of the newer ones that I'm going to kind of demonstrate today is the Bulma.io. And so this is a CSS framework. It's based on Flexbox for its kind of grid layout, and it's pretty nice. I like it. There are many other ones. You could search for them and find them. A really popular one was, the Bootstrap framework that came out. I think it was released by Twitter originally, a long time ago. But basically, these frameworks are existing CSS rules that are already defined by somebody. They've been compiled into an external style sheet, and you basically just load that style sheet into your website, and you are kind of ready to go using their styles. So, of course, that means that you are kind of committed to using their CSS rule set and how they think it should work. So some of these sites, or some of these frameworks like Bulma, they try to make that a little bit easier by allowing you to customize primary colors and stuff like that, to make things a little bit more customized towards how you want it to be. But you're still, their buttons look like this and their forms look like that, and that's the way it is. And so the trade-off from having that kind of uniformity of their style being on your site is that you can very quickly develop a site and mock up the CSS. So if you were going to do like a quick, rapid prototype site, and you really just wanted to get something running and working immediately, I would say definitely check out using a CSS library to get kind of up and running really quickly. And then you could always modify those styles, or replace it with your own styles later if you wanted to. So we're going to do an example here. We're going to remix the New York Times site again. So let's remix it. And we're going to look at using a Bulma to apply our CSS styles. So to get started, we'd have to figure out how to actually implement the CSS framework on our site. So if you come to the Bulma.io website, they have documentation. All the CSS libraries you might come across will have these documentation. And you have a couple options here. So you can either use their content delivery network, their CDN, or you can download and upload the files yourself to your own server. So the main thing here is that you have to get their CSS rules onto your site somehow, for you to be able to use their rules. And so if you're using a content delivery network, basically you are just going to be including an external style sheet and including it in your page. The other way of doing this would be actually uploading the CSS file to your server and having it served that way. So one way is you're really dependent on that content delivery network staying up and being there forever. And if it goes down, then your site pretty much breaks. And otherwise, if you upload your own CSS file to your server, then it will be there for as long as the server is there, and it will be pretty stable. The reason though you'd want to use a CDN is because when that file is being served, it might be this case that many websites start using the same CDN style sheet, so the same link all over the place. And so if someone went to another site and they use Bulma and they cache that CSS, when they came to your site and you're using the same version, the same Bulma CSS library, it's already cached in their browser, so they don't have to make that request again to download the CSS again. So there might be like a few, milliseconds quicker because that cached version is being reused and not the having to download it again from your server. But so we're going to go through not using the CNN, but actually uploading the file to our server. In this case, it's our glitch server. So I'm just going to extract this file just so we can see it. This Bulma 0.9. And so in this directory, it might be a little bit hard to see, but in this directory, there's a CSS file and there's a Sass file. Sass is basically a CSS precursor, so it's a kind of like it's a language similar to CSS that compiles into CSS. So basically, you can write Sass files that have a lot more kind of logic built into them, and then they compile into a CSS file, and you can use that. So we are not going to be using Sass. We're not compiling our Sass files into CSS. If you want to do some customizations, you'd have to modify the the Sass source and then compile it into Sass, or compile it into CSS. Sorry, this is getting very confusing. And then using that CSS on your site. So we're not going to make any modifications to this using Sass. We're just going to use their CSS directly. And so in this folder, I have a number of options here. I have a file called bulma.css, and that's 237 kilobytes. And then I have a Bulma called min.css, and that's 200 kilobytes. And so if you open up these two files in your editor, here's the Bulma CSS. It looks like a very traditional CSS style sheet. And then here's the Bulma min.css. And so you'll notice it's one line of roles. And so what this is basically is that this min file is basically compressed as much as possible. All the white space is removed. Any sort of variable name or something like that is shortened to be very small. And basically it's trying to save as much, like squeeze out as much space as possible out of the file itself. And the problem with that, right, is that it's now very hard to look at and very hard to understand what's going on. And the reason being that there's only 37 kilobytes difference, right? But if you are getting 1 million hits a day, 37 kilobytes times 1 million adds up pretty quickly, right? So using the smallest file asset possible is a good goal. For us, that's not really a problem yet, right? We're not thinking about large scale or stuff like that. So we're just going to use the regular uncompressed Bulma CSS file. So I remixed this site, and basically I'm in my public folder, and I'm going to say, click on this drop down here. I'm going to say, let me switch back to this. I'm going to say add files to folder. I'm going to say upload a file, and I'm going to go to that downloads folder and go to that Bulma, and then go to CSS, and then go to bulma.css and upload it. So it put it up into just the basic where the root of the system is. So you can come in here and rename it and say public / Bulma CSS, and that will move it into the public folder. So now it's in there with my style CSS and my client.js file. So the first thing we would want to do, right, is make sure that this is included in our page. So if we go to our home page and we just basically duplicate this external style sheet, right? So we're including Bulma, and we're including our external style sheet, our style.css. And so what's important though is that we want to make sure that our style sheet comes last, right? So Bulma is going to import a bunch of styles, and it's going to basically change how everything works on our site. But if we want to modify something back to, customize it a little bit, we want to make sure our styles are the last thing loaded that overwrites any of the Bulma changes. So we want to make sure our style.css is the last one loaded and not Bulma. So I'm just going to go into the other couple pages and add that Bulma link too. All right, So that's really it to get the software installed on our server, right? So now it's there, and we could verify this by going to look at our site, and we go to inspect, and we can see in the network tab, if we go to CSS and refresh, we'll see that Bulma is now being loaded. And you actually can see automatically Bulma has a default font family being used, different default size. And so all of a sudden it looks different, right? All the margins are gone, etc., right? So Bulma's already kind of like taking control of the styles. All right, so we lost a lot of style here. So the home page uh, is the first thing we'll try to style. And so basically we want to really dive into the Bulma documentation. And that's basically what happens if you use a external or a CSS library. You really have to understand like how that library works and how you're going to implement it on your site. So now you have to go from like knowing the details about CSS rules to knowing how they apply those CSS rules and how you might want to use them. So a pretty common thing is, right, I think we started off on the nav bar last time, right? The header at the top. So you come in here and you have to look at all the basic things they have. They have layouts, they have form elements, what does a radio button look like? They have what does, buttons look like? What do titles look like? How do they do column layouts, etc. And then they also have some kind of pre-made components that are very common in web development. So this is nice because, as like I said, if you were doing something really quickly, you want to get up and running really quickly, you can just jump in here and use some of their code. So they actually already have a nav bar ready to go. And so they have an example here of a nav bar that is would be at the top of their page. And so basically what you can do is you can copy this element, this code that they have, and put it into your site on the home page, right? So we have our header there. So let's replace this with our nav bar that we copied from them. So we'll tab it over. And so we can see if we go visit our home page on our preview of it, we now have a header basically ready to go, right? It's been defined there. There's some overlap with the glitch fish, but that's okay. We can fix that later. But basically, there's basically a basic menu system ready to go. And so, of course, we'd want to change this, right? We don't want the Bulma logo to be there. So we'll probably come in here and get rid of that. Maybe we'll put like a little NYT bestseller text there or something. You might want to put your own logo there or something like that. And then we have a home, right? And so that home would go to href equals the /, right? Because it's home. We don't have a documentation, but we have a advanced search, right? Advanced search, and that would go to href search, right? And then they have this drop down here where it's like this more stuff with nested stuff. And our site's not that complicated yet, but it's nice to know that you can do that. But we'll get rid of that for now. And then they have this nav bar and where there is these two buttons here, which is very cool if you want to use that. We don't necessarily have a use for that right now, so we're just going to drop that out. And so we modified this, so now we have this existing nav bar that is functional, right? And of course, this looks like a Bulma nav bar. That's the way it looks. That's the kind of functionality it is. So you notice in the HTML that I pasted here, there's a lot of classes already defined, right? So that's how this works, right? That's how these CSS libraries work. Basically, there is a CSS rule called navbar menu and navbar item, etc. And those are defined, and you have to use those keywords in your code for that style to apply. So it goes from knowing exactly how the CSS style works to knowing what you need to call your code or what classes you need to use to get it working in your site. So let's take a look at some other stuff we can do, right? So there is a, let's say we want to make this New York Times seller logo better. And so notice if we change this to an H1, you would expect it to be a larger font, right? The largest font possible, header 1, right? But nothing happened, right? Nothing changed it. So Bulma has overridden those H rules to not behave that way anymore, right? So you had to say, like, okay, well, how do I make things titles now, Bulma? And so you'd have to come in here and go to, like, say, okay, helpers, typography. We have different sizes to choose from, right? So if you want a very large font size, you say you use the class is size 1 as the header 1 size. So let's go in here and try to edit this. And so there's already an navbar item class, so we're going to add another is size 1 class and take a look at how it looks. And so now it's much bigger, right? Maybe too big. Let's make it a 2, size 2. So something like that, right? So you are now kind of dependent on the framework to understand how it works and figure out what classes you need to use for it to look good on your site. All right, so the other thing we had on this homepage and originally was like the 3 random books, right? And so we'd want to figure out how to do columns. So they have a column section. And so let's just figure out a basic column here. So in this case, they have 4 equal columns, and this is basically the code they use to apply those columns. So let's try it on our site. We have code there, and we'll say, book 1, book 2, and book 3. And we don't have a 4th column, so we'll get rid of that. And let's see how it looks. So it looks pretty good, right? It looks like it's doing a job at dividing the page into 3 equal columns, right? And so the nice thing though about a framework is that it's already thought about CSS responsiveness, which we haven't really thought about yet in our vanilla CSS. And so when you start doing things like resizing, it automatically has these breakpoint triggers where it will flow to be responsive. So it kind of has responsiveness built into it automatically. And so we still might want to make these things center in here. So you might be able to come into here and figure out how to do centering, perhaps. And you can always also go back and add an additional CSS rule to this, right? To center text line center stuff, right? So we could always come in here and say, give it another random book, a random book item. And go into our CSS, right? And say text align center. So now it's using the Bulma code to give this a column layout, and we're still providing our own little bit of extra bit to it, right, to make it centered. All right, so let's think about what was the big thing we had for these. We had images, right? So we went through that big ordeal of figuring out how to make these images appear correctly, or a little bit better. And so let's go into Bulma to see if Bulma has any better ways of helping us do that. So let's see, elements, images. And so they have various fixed square image sizes here, rounded images, etc. So you can have a 128 by 128 rounded image. And so you can have these various default sizes of images. So I really don't know how this will behave. So let's give it a shot and see what it looks like just by using their default stuff, right? So let's go to our home page, and inside the first div here, we're going to make a figure. I'm just copying from the Bulma code. And then they have is rounded, image, etc. And then they have the URL that you're supposed to use for the image there. So remember, for our code, that's stored in this cover variable, so we just have to slot in that piece of data, right? So let's see what it does. It's not exactly rounded, right? It's going to be a little bit more oval. And it definitely is like breaking something somehow, right? It's like clipping the rest of the things. But I mean, it looks kind of cool in a way, in its own way, if you could make it work. Let's see what else they have here. So they have responsive images with ratios. All right, so you could say this is an image and it's a square. It's an image, it's a 5 by 4. So these are different aspect ratios, right? So if we come in here and say, yeah, this is more like a book cover-ish image. Let's see how this behaves if we use these classes. So it gives you the class you have to use. Image is 4 by 5, right? And so what we're going to do is basically just apply those styles to our page, right? So image, this is where you would use it. And you say image is 4 by 5. And let's get rid of this is rounded for now just to see how it behaves. All right. So it actually looks pretty not bad, right? So I think it's stretching it a little bit, right, to make it fit the whole aspect ratio. Let's see what it looks like is rounded. Let's see what happens. Yeah, I mean you lose a little bit of content, right? So we'll get rid of that, right? So let's do this for the other two and see if how it looks. Yeah, I mean it honestly doesn't look too bad, right? So then you could, you know, of course, add in the title. You probably want to add that in as a div, and we'll give it a class, right? And you have to use Bulma's sizing, right? So we'll say is size, we'll give it a size 4. See how that looks. Pretty big, right? Let's maybe we'll do F6. Maybe pretty good. All right, so we could just repeat that. All right, so then we have there's some problem here with it's kind of not great as far as being flush with the margin of the border of the page. So you could probably, you know, you could come in here and give your main style, maybe just give it a padding left, you know, 1 EM, padding right, 1 EM, just to see how that looks, right? So it's a little bit better. So, you know, it's not exactly how we were doing it earlier, but you know, in a few minutes, honestly, I was able to quickly mock up this using their existing styles rather than going through and having to figure out exactly all the CSS rules to get it working for me. So in that aspect, it's pretty successful in that it's very quick, you know, to get working and get something functioning, and it has this responsiveness built in, right, as I mentioned before. So the other thing on the homepage we had, I think that was it. We got rid of the data. the rest of the data that was being displayed. And that was it. So if we go look at the, oh, we lost the, yeah, so we lost it. So when it gets to a certain size, it turns into this hamburger menu that you'd have to have some JavaScript to make it work. But it looks very, because we're enlarging the page so you can see, so this is 100%. So yeah, you probably want to, it looks extremely wide, right? You probably want to play around with adding some more margins or making that display div not so large, right? So you probably want to give this class like random book holder and give that style some more padding, right? Or actually maybe even just make it a static width. See if that works, 75%. Yeah, you'd have to play around with it, right? And then you can, of course, give it a margin. Just try to center it. Yeah, you have to play around with like the spacing in between all of it, but you know, quite quickly you're able to get it to a point where it's pretty presentable. All right, so another example of Bulma is like their styles dedicated to the input boxes, right, and other form elements. So if we look at how to style these in the Bulma style, we'd have to go to their documentation and go to their, I think it's, make this a little smaller, go to their, they have a form and input areas, right? So they have various ways of styling their inputs, but basically you can control the size of it, right? You can control roundedness, you can control how it behaves, you can even give it a little kind of loading animation, etc., right? So let's just give it a give it a little class of input, and it will turn it into more of a Bulma styled input. So let's look at it before, right? And then give it the style. And we're simply just going to be giving it the input a class of input. And now if we go to search, it now looks like this. So we'd have to figure out, read the rules, right, for how it's supposed to work. So it looks like it's expanding across the entire width of it. So we'd have to look how they're implementing it. And it looks like they have kind of like a field holder here, this field control. So let's try using let's try replicating one of their small fields here. See if that looks any better. Yeah, so you'd have to add a container, right, that holds it to prevent it from going all the way. So it behaves differently from the way you would think it behaves, but from your a regular input box, right? So you'd have to say something like, make the field around it have a specific width, right? And then, you know, styling it in different ways like that. We could see if, so it now has like this nice hover and focus color, etc., right? We'd have to see for other types of form things like selects, right? So this is what their select drop-down box looks like, slightly different. And basically, you just give it the class, and so they have the select, but then they wrap it in a div with a select class. So we'd have to go in and change the way our code works, right? By saying, okay, now there's a div actually around the select, and it says select class. So by doing that, it should change it to a Bulma one, right? And so this looks a little bit weird because it's zoomed in quite a bit, but you'd have to play around with their sizing and their formatting of how their default of their things look to get it to work right for you. But yeah, they have different colors and roundedness, etc. Right? Let's make it rounded. Is rounded. Yeah, so you could turn the other one, of course, into the same matching. Right. So what's nice about this is that it defines consistency for you, right? All of your inputs look the same. They all have a very consistent messaging as far as colors and sizes, etc., right? So which is good for uh, having inputs. And of course, you can have buttons, right? So you'd have to come in here and see how to use a button. So if you wanted a uh, outline button, you simply say class button is outlined. And that turns it into a Bulma outline button, right? And it's consistent with this Bulma style. Right. So the other thing would be like, applying for the search page, applying the same idea of, we could use the same homepage image technique where it's using the Bulma images to kind of display things in a locked aspect ratio. I don't know if there would be anything particularly good for data, right? But you could come in here and see what sorts of stuff they have, some pre-made components or elements to see if they have anything that would look good for data. So they have a table. So you might want to use one of their tables to display that metadata for each search results. That could be possible. Something like this. They also have the tag. So those are tags. You want to have a tag icon, and etc. Right? So you might end up actually saying, well, actually, Bulma does not have a consistent styling that would be useful for me to display a list of metadata, right? And actually better to go back to using my the TD or the DD and the DT kind of lists and styling those independently. So that's a good point where that not the framework's not always going to have a very good way for you to quickly style exactly what you want. These are kind of like the least common denominator things where there's often everyone has to do a column layout. So let's do a quickly way of doing column layouts. Everyone's going to have buttons, etc., right? But your site, this specific site, is going to have a metadata list of metadata fields. So that's not something that's very common across all sites. So there's obviously not a quick way of doing it. But you could probably use the layout to quickly make the book cover and the metadata, as we did in the original video, separate, and then play around with different kind of layouts. And so, of course, that's nice because for this, it would be responsive, right? So it automatically collapse as you resize the window or for different devices. So I would say that would be an option, right, for the the search page, and then the home page, of course, is the book page is very similar to both of those pages. So I would say this, you could play around with these frameworks. You'll probably find one that you prefer using to quickly kind of rapidly prototype something. And then you can always, of course, come back and add more stuff to it and make it better. But so for this week, the challenge is to try to get your project site, whether it's the New York Times site or the IMDb or museum site, and try using a CSS framework instead of just doing the CSS manually. You can use Bulma like we are here, or you can use Bootstrap, or you could find your own. There's many other different types of CSS libraries focusing on different things. But give them a try and see how you like them and if you have any problems trying to implement them on your site. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.